Dear moderator, speakers, and our followers on social media, I am Sharifa Raisi, and I welcome you all on behalf of Dr. Mohammed Al Ali, the chairman of the board and CEO of Trends Research and Advisory. We have gathered tonight to discuss an important subject which is critical for a broader understanding of the world around us, emerging technologies, and the future of global security. Many factors determine global security but among its most defining factors is the evolution of military technologies. Technology influences us in more ways than one. It's changing our lifestyles at a human level, and it's also redefining international relations. Overall, it's covered a wide range of subjects. For this reason, we have broken down tonight's discussions into three broad areas. The first one deals with the impact of autonomy and artificial intelligence on international security and strategic stability, while AI excites all of us. We are yet to understand its larger implication, especially in the military domain. The second subject under spotlight today is the global security environment and its future trends, risks, and opportunities. Last but not least is technology and the future of warfare, which is evolving all the time. To discuss all this, we have gathered a very impressive panel of experts who are going to enrich us with their understanding of the subjects. I once again thank you all for joining us tonight and look forward to engaging, informative, and enriching debates. With these remarks, I give the floor to our moderator of the evening, Dr. Christian. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sharifa. Good evening, good afternoon to all. My name is Dr. Christian Alexander. I'll be the moderator for this event. On behalf of Trends Research and Advisory again, I'd like to welcome all of the three distinguished speakers along with all of our online attendees to this e-discussion on emerging military technologies and the future of global security. I would like to remind all panelists that you have approximately 20 minutes time for your respective presentation. Each presenter will be given 1 minute to briefly summarize their main message that they would like the audience to take away from their presentation at the end of the session. So without further ado, let me introduce the first presenter, Dr. Jean-Marc Ricli. He is the head of Global Emerging Risk at the Geneva Center for Security Policy in Switzerland. Dr. Ricli was previously assistant professor at the Department of Defense Studies of King's College London and the Institute for International and Civil Security at Khalifa University in Abu Dhabi. His presentation is entitled The Impact of Autonomy and Artificial Intelligence on International Security and Strategic Stability. Please, Dr. Ricli.
Thank you very much for this introduction, and thank you for Trends for this invitation. So the purpose of my talk today is to discuss a bit more the impact of autonomy and artificial intelligence on international security as well as strategic stability. So we'll look at what AI is all about and look also first at some already noticeable security implications of AI, and we then talk about swarming surrogate warfare and the future, which is combination of AI and neural technology. So what is AI? AI is not something that is new, was coined in the 50s, but in essence, it is about computers being able to perform tasks that normally require human intelligence. The purpose here is not to define what AI is very carefully, because there is a broad discussion that range from weak AI to super intelligence. But the purpose of this presentation is really to look at where we are now in terms of how we use algorithm and what the impact are all about. So if we look at why it is we are currently talking a lot about AI, well, it's because for AI to work, you need two things. You need an engine, which is the computing power and the fuel, which is data. And in the 2010s, what we started to see is the verification of experiment that had been thought earlier, but also techniques that had been developed in the 80s, not only in machine learning, deep learning. And that was possible because of the growth in both computing power and data generation. This graph shows a logarithmic graph of all the CPUs, so the processing units have been produced since the 70s. And what we see is there is a strong linear relationship, and this relationship tells you that the computing power doubles every 18 months. But with development in AI, this doubling period has moved from 18 months to 3 months and a half, which means that a computer from 2012 to 2006, if you take these 6 years, the CPUs evolved by a factor of 12, whereas algorithmic computation evolved by a factor of 300,000. So 300,000 times more powerful than 6 years earlier. Also, when it comes to data generation, because we are increasingly consuming data and because of the Internet of Things, where we increasingly use connected devices, we are developing more and more data. Just look at, for instance, the number of gigabyte that Americans used every minute in 2017, 2.6 million gigabyte. 2 years later, we are close to 4.5 million gigabytes. So it almost doubled in a matter of 2 years. And so one of the first domain where artificial intelligence was used is in the gaming industry. Why gaming? Because gaming is simple, relatively, because it's bounded by simple rules, but also because there are lots of data. And the most complex board game in the world is the game of Go. And in 2016, the second best player of the game of Go was defeated 4 times out of 5 games by a computer called AlphaGo. So in terms of the complexity of the game, there is this indicator called state space complexity that is equivalent to 10 to the power of 70. I'm just putting that here for you to give you an idea about the magnitude of the complexity of the game. We evaluate that there are about 10 to the power of 80 atoms in the universe. But it didn't stop there, because beyond board games, then you have electronic games and pokers. And what we've seen is similar achievement in the game of poker, where an algorithm in 2017 called Libertas defeated 4 the best human players at the game of Texas Hold'em Unlimited Poker, where the player that lost the least lost $80,000. The one that lost the most, 800, and the computer made 1.5 million. What was a breakthrough here is that, unlike board games, at the game of poker, you can bluff. And then it's by bluffing, you increase the amount of possibility to infinity. And so that kind of game, which in game theory are game with infinite undetermined information, are those games that basically are modeling human behavior. And so that went to so far as the best player of the game of Go in 2019 decided to quit the game because it could no longer be won by humans. So, as I mentioned earlier, what we see now is developments of AI, what we call weak artificial intelligence. That is, an algorithm has been trained to play or to perform a specific task. Here, for instance, this algorithm has been trained to solve the Rubik's Cubes. The human record at Rubik's Cube, it's about 4.5 seconds, and you'll see here how fast the algorithm has been able to solve this problem.
Solving in 3, 2, 1.
0.25 seconds. So the point here is that if your jobs or activity depends on solving Rubik's Cube, if you are pitted against an algorithm, you're out of the game. So moving that kind to from that kind of game to activities that involve human beings, especially in the military, we already started to see some instances of the power of algorithm, for instance, when it comes to dogfighting, where in 2 different experiments, a top fighter pilot instructor were defeated by an algorithm in simulation of dogfighting. And if you read the sentence here about how the gentleman on the left felt during this simulation, he felt completely exhausted, and he had the feeling that the algorithm was in a way already knew already what he was about to do. And for those in the military, this is a key concept of targeting strategy called OODA, observation, orientation, decision, action, where the goal is actually to get into the decision making cycle of your adversary in order to influence it. Others earlier observation about the impact of artificial intelligence on international security is obviously in the field of subversion, as we've seen it in the 2016 election, about how social media were actually used to amplify some messages. And again, the similar things happened this last year with the pandemic, as well as with posts of people from QAnon or extremist movements, where social media basically magnify the audience of those posting that kind of messages. And basically, the algorithm contributes to create an information bubble or disinformation bubble. And that goes for the US election, for instance, or the coronavirus crisis, with those being against vaccination. But in terms of true AI manipulation, I think probably a breakthrough is in the development of what we call generative adversarial networks, which are 2 algorithms that are pitted against each other in a zero-sum game scenario, where one has to develop or create a picture and the other has to evaluate whether it's a true picture or a wrong picture. This technology, GANs, was developed scientifically in 2014, and you can see how fast it has developed in a matter of 5 years. All the persons you see here do not exist. They have been synthetically engineered, developed by an algorithm. So what AI is doing is playing on our psychological biases and basically amplify the asymmetry between how fast and how far lies spread over truth. And there is a strategic advantage or a structural advantage for lies and fake news to spread much wider and much faster than truth. And that creates a polarization, and it increases polarization in all societies, because basically what these algorithms are doing, they lock people in their own disinformation information bubble. Beyond disinformation, what we can also see is how, for instance, AI could be used, and GANs could be used to modify a CT scan or MRI of a brain, for instance, where an experiment was conducted in Tel Aviv. A medical imagery center was hacked, and the MRI pictures was transformed through GANs and then showed to radiologists, and 100% of radiologists were fooled by the modification. It is also suspected that GANs could be used to modify, for instance, satellite pictures by adding bridges or roads or something else. And increasingly, what we see is that by training AI against a human being or with human beings, AI is able to learn their own patterns and therefore look at our vulnerabilities in order to engineer a winning strategy. The area in terms of weaponization that probably is of the most of concern this day is what we call swarms. You might have seen swarms of drones. In some countries, fireworks are currently, or nowadays, they are prohibited. Since instead of fireworks, what we have, we take drones and we start to make some figures in the sky. The world record in 2018 was with Intel flying 2018 drones for the 50th anniversary of Intel. It would be impossible for any human being to control on its own 2018 drones. Therefore, here you have to rely on an algorithm that creates this swarm. These swarms are not autonomous because they have been pre-programmed. But swarming is increasingly developed at the doctrinal level as well as practically when it comes to the military, because the idea here is to create a coordinated group of single units that will create its own collective intelligence through emerging properties. And here the analogy is the flock of birds, where if you look at how this flock is actually moving, it is not masterminded by one single bird, but the aggregation of the behavior of every single bird creates this shape. This is an emerging properties, and this is basically what we are trying to do with swarm in the military, because if we manage to create fully autonomous swarm, what will happen is that they will combine mass firepower, speed, and concentration of forces to the level that we haven't yet seen. And so both China, the United States, and other countries are actually investing heavily into that kind of research. And so one of the first areas where swarm have been used is with weaponized drones. And here you have pictures of drones that were used during the latest conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, the Bayraktar TB2 Turkish drone, and the Israeli Harop drone, a loitering munition. And you can see now what a loitering munition like Harop is doing in conflict. So basically, this drone has been tasked to monitor a specific area, and then it locks in on a specific target and then crash into that. As you can see, was so effective that the Azeri forces managed to destroy 47% of Armenian combat vehicle and 93% of artillery of Armenia. What we see, though, which is also of concern, is that once that kind of technology is developed, it democratizes very quickly, and it proliferates also very quickly. An example of such a process is, for instance, in 3D printing, where you can see the first 3D printed gun that was done in the early 2000s, and then we have seen development of Turgam. That gun is completely 3D printed. And 2 years ago, the terrorists who attacked the synagogue in Halle, Germany, basically had that kind of 3D printed gun in his car. He didn't use it, but he brought it with him. Also, during the fight against ISIS, during the Battle of Mosul, ISIS, Islamic State, bought some commercial drones, replaced the camera with a small pod that contained a hand grenade, and could launch swarms of drones that were killing up to 30 Iraqi soldiers on a weekly basis. This was the first time that a non-state actors managed to reach, for a specific time, tactical air supremacy over traditional armed forces. And since then, we've seen a repetition of the use of drones being against Russian forces in Hmeimim in Syria, or against Saudi Aramco facilities in Abqaiq and Kuwait in September 2019. What we start also to see emerging is that kind of commercial drones that could be weaponized. My favorite is the one in the middle, which is a flying AK-47. Probably very cheap to buy. You can imagine if an actor would buy 1,000 of these and basically use swarming algorithms that you can find on certain websites, and you can download for free. You can imagine the impact this could have. So that leads to basically the silver bullet of the 21st century, which are autonomous weapons systems, which are weapons that are able to compose independently different courses of action based on goals that are predetermined, but also based on the knowledge of the situation and the understanding of the world and the situation in itself. Currently, we don't have fully autonomous weapon system, but as the Harop drone has demonstrated, we are getting closer and closer to this. So what we see also emerging is that great powers have understood the benefits and the advantage of developing such weapons. And since in 2016, a Defense Science Board of the US Defense Department published a report on autonomy. And the message was clear. In order to win a conflict in the 21st century, we have to invest in this technology in order to remain ahead of our adversaries. That led to basically an arms race where China, Russia, but also other countries and middle power and even small powers are investing into this. But probably the first true fully autonomous weapon system will not be physical. It will be in the cyber domain. Currently, when we talk about cyber offensive operation, it ranges from sabotage to subversion. Sabotage requires technical prowess, but not many people, whereas subversion requires social mobilization, mass, but not technical prowess. With AI, what we're doing, we're merging basically technical prowess and social mobilization so that the algorithm can learn on its own and adapt. And so because the cyber domain has less obstacle than the physical domain, probably a fully autonomous weapons system will be developed in the field. IBM developed a proof of concept in 2018 called DeepLocker, which is a malware equipped with a neural network that is able to learn from its environment. And for instance, if it is embedded in an application, a video application, it would, for instance, only deliver its payload when, for instance, it has been trained to identify my face. So what are the implications of swarming? Well, because these weapons are relatively cheap to manufacture, once the technology has been developed, proliferation is very likely. And so it will be very easy to scale this weapon. And so that will create a situation where the enemy's defenses will be saturated and overwhelmed. And therefore, that provides a dominance to the offensive. The reaction of people will be that if you see that you live in an offensive dominant environment, the best way to protect yourself is to attack first. Attacking first is the concept of preemption. But preemption is a violation of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, which prohibits the use of force in international relations, except in two exceptions. So basically, development and swarming in the future has the ability to completely upset the so-called offense-defense balance towards the offensive, and that will create a much more competitive international environment, and that will favor international arms race. But we are already getting there, because increasingly what we are seeing is that the swarms that we are already seeing now are so fast that it becomes impossible for human beings or for current system to thwart them. And therefore, the idea is slowly sinking in that we need to invest more and more in algorithm, and for the director of Joint AI Center in the US Defense Department, for him already, war in the future will be algorithm against algorithm. Even some people are advocating for using algorithm and AI and automatization and autonomy even in the nuclear domain. This was part of a blog post 2 years ago. It was very highly criticized because no one for now, which is saying, would actually argue for providing autonomy to nuclear weapons. But still, again, the idea is sinking in. And so what it leads to a situation where technology is becoming increasingly autonomous and therefore is able to perform tasks on behalf of human beings. And here what you get is this idea of surrogate warfare, where states and non-state actors increasingly in the 21st century will be able to wage war by using either or both human and or technological surrogate. And I will finish with the future. The future is what we start to see now, which is the integration of human beings, the human brain, with the algorithm through human-machine teaming. And here the idea is, for instance, when it comes to air squadron, to replace pilots, just have one pilot that will be able to direct a squadron of drones. And this concept is called loyal wingman. It has been put into practice last year for the first time in Australia. And Russia, China, and the United States are heavily invested into that. For the future that is a bit further is the real integration, the connection between the human brain and the weapon, notably for what we call brain-computer interfaces. I will not go too much into detail into that. You can read my latest publication on that, and we can discuss it during the question and answer. So for you, what are possible takeaway? Well, you have to understand that the pace at which these technologies develop, not just AI, but quantum computing, neurotechnology, synthetic biology, is sometimes, and most of the time, exponential. That creates a situation where there is strong vertical and horizontal proliferation to states, to great power, to smaller power, but also to states, to non-state actors. The data explosion is changing the way we will fight war in the 21st century, where digital technologies and data are becoming of increasing importance. And again, that will also empower non-state actors that have now the means to have access to this. And therefore, technology will become increasingly a surrogate on its own, and that will lead to greater likelihood of arms race. In order to toward that, the international community has to define some regulation, but also we need to invest into foresight, resilience, and polymath thinking to understand that, to develop scenarios about the future where we can think about what will be coming, so as to avoid the misuse and malicious uses of this technology. And I stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Whitley. Very interesting. I hope we get to talk about some of your points later on. We move on to Dr. Eli Zaltzman. He is the Israel Visiting Assistant Professor of Israel Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park, and board member at MITVIN, the Israeli Institute of Foreign Regional Policy. His presentation is on the global security environment, future trends, risks, and opportunities. Please, Dr. Zaltzman.
Thank you so much, Christian. Thank you so much for Trends Research and Advisory for inviting me, and for Jean-Marc. This is the risk, and this is the benefit of having somebody so savvy and so smart as Jean-Marc just speaking ahead of you. He kind of covers all the bases and leaves you with nothing to say that is new and innovative. But at the same time, I'll rely on certain elements that he kind of mentioned and build on that to make an argument that is pretty much in line, but perhaps kind of focusing on certain other elements as well. So how important are emerging technologies to global security? Very much, obviously, as we just seen in the clip from Nagorno-Karabakh, and so on and so forth. But consider, for example, in the United States, the newly created position within the U.S. National Security Council, creating a Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technologies. So cyber we knew, and now emerging technologies got a new label, a new title, a position that was just created in mid-January by the Biden administration. So this is indicative of how important it is and how central it is to US national security in its view of the future or global security landscape. In addition, a recent US congressional report from November 2020 identified 6 new technologies that would have a profound impact on global security. One of which Jean-Marc just related to, AI, artificial intelligence, lethal autonomous weapons is the second one, hypersonic weapons, direct energy weapons, biotechnology, and quantum technology. So what is interesting about that, and again, this is something that was touched upon by the previous speaker, is that the report highlights 2 critical trends or aspects that facilitate these technologies and their changes over time and make them extremely impactful and important. First of all, is the rapid evolution of technology, but secondly, it's the rapid proliferation of such technologies. So it's not only that it's becoming extremely more sophisticated, but it becomes kind of a common sense idea, lots of stakeholders, lots of shareholders, if you'd like. And this is in part because of the very strong connection between state and private enterprises, technological companies, and so on and so forth. So these are non-exclusive and extremely innovative technologies. For example, the Boston-based DARPA company or firm was purchased by Google a few years ago. Then it was purchased by Hyundai, and between that, a Japanese bank. So you can see that technology now proliferates even faster. So I will focus on the relationship between states, although we can certainly talk about non-state actors and their use of advanced military technologies. Think about the equivalent of a dirty bomb, if you wish. This was in the nuclear age. You would put a suitcase in the middle of Manhattan and it would blow up. It's not too sophisticated, kind of a small device, very rudimentary. You can think about certain elements like that used by non-state actors. In part, as I said, Jean-Marc used examples from ISIS. So rather than survey the technical aspects, I'm not an engineer, I have no idea, I'm pretty low tech myself on a personal level. I'll talk about the politics of it, something that I'm more interested or more profoundly knowledgeable, if you wish. And I would argue, similar again to Jean-Marc, and this is the risk, all these technologies have I would say, a pretty intrinsic offensive character. Their feature is offensive. Even if they are defensive, their impact is offensive in nature, and they create more sense or a greater sense of insecurity on the other side. This is not to say that this is in the classical sense, offense-defense balance theory or such. We're not talking about large-scale wars that are around the corner in the magnitude of the First World War or the Second World War, but rather the adversaries will find it easier to employ military forces or military capabilities that are based on advanced technologies, AI, and the such. And as a result of that, you will see more conflicts. And in addition, you will see greater efforts to cope with technological changes. In other words, you will have an arms race that is based on technology, on the capacity to create these technologies. So a wonderful quote that I have from Mark Esper, the former Secretary of State, or Secretary of Defense, apologies, says that history has taught that those who are first to harness such innovation often gain a decisive advantage on the battlefield for many years that follow. And another example is Vladimir Putin, who said that the leader in artificial intelligence research will become the ruler of the world. So just to make sure that we understand that these are questions, these are technologies that are at the core of the vision, if you wish, of the future landscape of global security. I would argue that it's not just the technology that creates kind of insecurity or the increases the risks for arms race and international discord. I would say that even the attempt to pursue such technologies can create strife and discord between countries or between different or adversarial actors. This can be a result of competition over natural resources that are critical for creating some of these technologies, but also the know-how, the ideas, the knowledge about these, designing and producing these technologies. So both the material, if you wish, and the ideational aspects of creating such technologies become a domain where discord, conflict, competition that possibly can escalate. Think about the Sino-American interaction, or I would say argument or disagreement about intellectual property and how critical that is. Or take another example, critical minerals or rare earths that play such a significant role in competition over dominating, for example, 5G technologies, or tension between the United States and China over heavy rare earth that is now used in production of certain advanced military or weapon systems, such as precision-guided missiles, and so on and so forth. So even after their processing, rare earths need to be turned into rare earth magnets, for example, found in China, who controls these resources and may dominate, if you wish, all the semiconductor and other technological implications of that. In fact, the US Department of Defense uses approximately 750,000 tons of rare earths every year. About 80% comes from China. In October 2020, President Trump, for example, signed an executive order declaring a national emergency in the mining industry, aimed at boosting domestic production of rare earth minerals critical for military technologies, while reducing the country's dependence on imports, especially from China. So if this was kind of there's a laundry list of materials that are critical, but overall the trajectory does not look promising. And indeed, in perfect timing, President Biden will sign later on today a new executive order ordering that the US government reviews the global supply chains used by 4 key industries, including critical minerals used in electronics. So this is to show you that the matter is not a partisan issue. It's not just one person, one country, but rather a strategic concern. And the fact that the review was pushed, among others, by the current National Security Advisor, Jack Sullivan, is telling that this is framed also, not only in terms of financial or economic terms, but also in terms of national security. From China's perspective, it's the same thing. It's just the flip side of the coin, if you wish. Rare earth minerals are also a matter of national security. And indeed, Beijing, according to Bloomberg News Agency, last week announced its intention to restrict shipment of rare earths to the United States, and also considering banning the sale of rare earths to private companies such as Lockheed Martin, which crossed Beijing after selling arms to Taiwan. So even it's not just the technology, it's also the products or the resources needed to create these technologies that are at the eye of the storm, or if you wish, part of this competition or this arms race. So I don't want to get into trying to convince you that these technologies have an offensive character. I think that Jean-Marc did a wonderful job, especially with swarming and the other elements. But I do want to say that these autonomous mechanisms, for example, AI, have inherent dangers, if you wish, of either intentionally creating or escalating conflict, or creating one when none existed before, but also if you can think about inadvertent escalation or inadvertent mistakes. Sometimes computers make mistakes. We know that quite well. And at the end of the day, for example, Paul Shore and Michael Horvitz argued that the current AI systems lack the general purpose reasoning that humans use to flexibly perform a range of tasks. So even if you assume that it's a fault-free, it's a bulletproof, no mistake mechanism, indeed there's still needs for some human touching, and perhaps that will be the weakest link, so to speak, or the soft spot. I would argue that from nanotechnology to biological weapons, these capabilities have the destruction potential never seen before, not only to critical infrastructure, because they can easily and effectively neutralize previously foolproof assets, both materially or material and non-material, but also to disable the ability to respond or to retaliate. For example, take NATO's new strategic concept paper from May 2010, arguing that the most destructive periods of history tend to be those when the means of aggression have gained the upper hand in the art of waging war. So these novel technologies will undoubtedly enable actors to have the upper hand in international security, the initiative, kind of a certain kind of impunity. There's an issue of attribution, and so on and so forth. It encourages, as Jean-Marc rightly said, arms races and competition over resources and knowledge, and open the door possibly for unintended consequences as well. I want to end this short conversation or short presentation with an optimistic note, so to speak. Even the most autonomous systems do require some form of human intervention, both in the design or the application or the direction, and so on and so forth. So there's still room for both human error, but at the same time, human control nevertheless. So the parameters that we prescribe to these systems will have an impact on the performance at the end of the day, unless we get to fully automated systems at the end of the road, as the previous speaker says. There is room and necessity, if you wish, to deliberate the dangers of such innovative technologies and think about the ways treaties, regimes, institutions, as well as other forms of international security governance can mitigate or regulate their destructive potential. We've seen such efforts in the nuclear era, creating a variety of mechanisms, international organizations, treaties, bilateral agreements, multilateral agreements that were brokered specifically to prevent the nightmare scenario from ever materializing. Such efforts were not always successful in preventing states from acquiring nuclear weapons, but they did alter, if you wish, the normative landscape or the normative calculus and the way policymakers thought about the use of nuclear weapons and their political limitations. I think we'll be extremely better off if we start thinking about not only the technological advantages of new military technologies, but also about trying to curb them and try to regulate them and restrain them from getting out of control, going into a kind of a back to the future scenario, if you want, or the worst case scenario, kind of a Terminator kind of a scenario where the robots take control of the world. I think that most of the conversation is focused on countries such as the United States, obviously, Russia and China, but I think that regional initiatives, and perhaps this is where Trends Research and Advisory can play a significant role, as well as the Europeans and others can kind of start making or taking the first step in starting this conversation. After all, some of the fallout, if you wish, or the future battleground might very well be involve the region, the Middle East, and the adjacent regions one way or another. Thank you so much. This is me for the time being.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zaltzman, very insightful. Okay, last but not least, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. John Anthony Hardy. He is the Assistant Dean of Graduate Studies at the Rabdan Academy here in Abu Dhabi. He was previously Director of Security Studies at Macquarie University and a Research Fellow at the Australian National Security College. His presentation is on technology and the future of warfare. Please.
Thank you very much. And I would also just really quickly like to thank the other speakers for their presentations, and to thank Director General Ahmed from Trends Research and Advisory for inviting me. And also a very quick thank you to Dr. Faisal Alain, who's our Vice President at Rabdan Academy, and Dr. Faisal Akabi, our Dean, who's in the audience tonight. So tonight I'm talking about technology and the future of warfare. And that's a little bit more specific perhaps than Jean-Marc and Eli spoke about just previously, where they introduced some really big picture issues that I think are really significant. I'm going to touch on a couple of similar issues with a little bit more narrow focus. And I'm going to argue that I think technology has a significant relationship with warfare, and that in the future, a lot of technological issues are going to have a significant impact. And I think that starts with the idea that throughout human history, technology has already shaped the evolution of warfare. And I'll make a really quick caveat from the beginning that I don't really intend to trigger a debate about the nature versus the character of war. I think that's a debate that we have quite often. So I'm going to prefer to try and limit my remarks this evening to warfare and war fighting, and not include the social and political institution of war, which I think we're all reasonably confident will remain virtually as stable throughout the 21st century as it has been in the past. But if we look to earlier periods, we start with the bow and the arrow, we start with the cannon. They're some of our earliest forms of standoff weapons. In recent decades, we've seen electronic technologies such as the portable radio, the personal computer, added to our vehicles, our systems, and our weapons. And today we currently regularly use long-range standoff weapons and satellite-enabled real-time data links to communicate rapidly around the world. And technological advancement has been fueled by billions of dollars in research and development investments. And the diffusion of military technology has influenced training and doctrine in militaries, the tactics that are used on battlefields, and the design of military operations. So in this presentation, I really would like to talk about two different types of important trends in the relationship between technology and warfare. And the first type is reflective, looking back at some of the key technological drivers of warfare that have led us from the last time we saw major wars between great powers up until today. A period which some commentators would see as the beginning of a period of decline in international security and stability, and perhaps a return towards great power competition. And the second type is necessarily speculative, looking at some of the technological drivers that we see emerging today and extrapolating our expectations from them. And these are more ambiguous. These drivers are ones which are likely to have consequences that we will not be able to foresee, and impacts that will be very difficult to gauge in advance. But these are also the challenges that I think we need to be prepared for in advance, and the ones that we really need to take steps in order to understand today. So with some previous trends, I would argue that since the end of World War II, there are really four key technological trends that distinguish contemporary warfare from the past. The first trend is the increasing precision of munitions, enabling military forces to find, fix, and finish targets with much greater discrimination. And we've come a long way. We've come a long way since the 6-week aerial campaign during Operation Desert Storm in January and February of 1991, which for many people remains the poster child of precision-guided munitions. In the 30 years since that, precision-guided weapons have been further enabled by technological advances like enhanced level of precision, increasing ranges, and also a very broad type of payloads that precision-guided munitions can deliver, ranging from very small payloads to very large ones. And I remain ambivalent about whether this necessarily means that warfare is smarter due to precision weapons. I know that smart weapons is a really popular phrase. I'm not entirely sure that weapons are smart in that sense, like smart technologies. But our application of force is definitely more directed, or perhaps more precisely targeted. I think the second trend is the increasing lethality and destructive capabilities of weapons technology that are used on contemporary battlefields. From individual and crew-served weapons to munitions to major combat platforms, I would say that the ever-growing capacity for military capability to engage and destroy targets has significantly increased the combat effectiveness of military units and altered the character of war in the contemporary period. I think a third trend is the increasing use of communications and battle space data systems in tactical force elements. And they've been improving coordination between and effectiveness of force elements for quite some time. And there's been a significant undercurrent in the adoption and evolution of maneuver warfare from World War II throughout contemporary armed conflicts. And to this day, we can see it in training and doctrine in a majority of professional militaries around the world. I think a fourth trend is the decreasing mortality of combatants. And we can look to life-saving surgical technologies, individual first aid equipment, and rapid airlift, which have all contributed substantially to improving the survivability of combat casualties in deployed military units. And I think that these enduring trends account for some of the significant technology-driven differences between contemporary battlefields and previous generations of warfare. And I think they also highlight the complex relationship that exists between the technology that we have available to us and the conduct of warfare at the tactical and operational levels. So I'll move to a couple of emerging trends. And I think that looking to the 21st century, there are 4 emerging drivers in military technology that are likely to influence the next generation of warfare. And the first driver is information and communications technology, and also, at least to some extent, the idea of a 4th industrial revolution. And I think it's difficult for us to conceive of a future in which the ongoing transformation of many aspects of human life with data generating and data sharing devices wouldn't spill over into the military domain. And advances in data communication technologies will almost certainly continue to shape the cognitive domain in which personnel interpret information and they make decisions at all levels of command. And I think one of the skill sets that the next generation of tactical commander particularly will need is the ability and the mental capacity to process a huge volume of data that's coming from their own human senses and then also from technical sensors at the same time. We can cram an awful amount of data into our data management systems. We can absolutely inundate people with different kinds of information, but then they have to be able to do something with it. And obviously, as both of the speakers previously mentioned, AI is going to have a particular role to play in managing that. But I think there's also a skill set that we need to develop in order to enable the next generation of leaders to be able to process information at a speed that makes them interface with those technologies effectively. And I think some precursor skills probably exist already today, but I don't think that anyone's really developed a method of information processing that's going to accommodate the decision-making needs of tomorrow's tactical commanders. So the second driver of technology, or the emerging driver, I think, is artificial intelligence and also autonomous and semi-autonomous systems. I think we focus a lot on autonomy, particularly the lethal kinds, but I see a much wider range of possible applications in the semi-autonomous space. I also think AI is going to be transformative in certain domain areas, and I think we've seen breathtaking advances in AI. I think Jean-Marc's slide, which showed some of the data on that, was absolutely beguiling when you think about the increases in processing power. But I think we're also still at the very beginning of the technical journey that AI is ultimately going to lead humanity on. And by the latter half of this century, it seems quite likely that advances in AI will allow for autonomous and semi-autonomous systems to augment a range of different facets of military decision-making. And I think increasingly autonomous systems will also improve on some of the current advantages that remote systems such as drones already bring to contemporary military forces. So for example, networks of semi-autonomous drones will be able to coordinate with each other to ensure that their already impressive persistence in a target area could be extended almost indefinitely through automated handovers, automated aerial refueling, things like that. Not just the ability to have time on target increased exponentially, but also the idea that we would be able to gather and collect information. We would have intelligence and ISR assets with almost impenetrable persistence that will be able to automatically replace each other, rotate each other, and possibly automate cycles for maintenance. So they could perhaps have a certain number or a fixed number of aerial refueling cycles before then they return to base for maintenance, things like that. I mean, those opportunities are enormous. I think the capability for us to automate data collection and collation, to automate data analysis, to visualize and manipulate big data in real time will greatly improve the utility and the quality of computer-aided decision support systems, particularly in dynamic command environments where we have forces deployed. A third driver, I think, is hypersonic weapons and countermeasures for those weapons. And the speed at which combat will take place with hypersonic weapons creates opportunities and challenges for all military forces. We spoke briefly already in the panel about the offense-defense balance, and I think advances in hypersonic technologies will continue to improve deterrence and first strike effectiveness of offensive weapons. And there's a huge advantage to offensive weapons from hypersonics. There's a massive disadvantage at the same time to defensive systems because it's going to increase the pressure on them. It will almost certainly at some point in the near future necessitate fully autonomous countermeasures because human decision cycles will simply be precluded by the shrinking time frame that people have to respond effectively to first strikes using hypersonic systems. And the fourth and final driver is biotechnology with military applications. And this is another field which is very much in its infancy right now, that is likely to have profound implications for military forces in the future. And some particularly useful applications might include rapid healing technologies, replacement or augmented limbs and organs, right through to physically enhancing individual warfighters, either temporarily or perhaps even permanently, beyond traditional human limits. And given the potential military applications of biotechnology, I think it's really difficult to envisage a future in which warfare wouldn't be influenced by it. So I think those four technological drivers signify a coming change in the character of warfare. I think it's one which is heavily influenced by technical, informational, and biological enhancements to decision-making in the future battlefield. I think there are also some challenges to our current conceptions about warfare and warfighting. And just as a quick example, one of them is battle space presence. Do our current conceptions of presence on a battlefield adequately explain the modern or the future battlefield? You know, questions like, is presence still defined by physical proximity to a weapon or to its effects? If so, does increasing removal or further distance from weapons or the weapon's effects change a combatant's relationship to the organized violence that they're participating in on a battlefield? And similarly, I think there are some interesting implications for the relationships between human decision makers and computer-aided systems. Questions of moral responsibility are one issue, but I also think there's a practical challenge of deconflicting lines of responsibility when it comes to operating complex systems, which will be an obstacle that future warriors will need to overcome. So just to quickly sum up, I think the relationship between technology and warfare will continue to evolve throughout the 21st century. I think warfare will almost certainly become faster and more complex as we introduce technological solutions to battlefield challenges. I suspect that closer integration between warfighters and technological systems will bolster combat effectiveness in professional militaries. Meanwhile, I think technological diffusion will empower actors with both the budget and the initiative to adopt, to train with, and ultimately deploy emerging technologies on future battlefields. And a key consideration for professional militaries is really going to be the extent to which non-state actors, or maybe quasi-states, are able to leverage future technologies to their advantage and potentially shrink the otherwise currently insurmountable capability gap that often exists between states and non-state forces. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hardy. Much appreciated. Maybe we can field some questions, and we can start off with one on drones. Maybe Dr. Rikli can address that one. Drones have become more common, more readily available, and more sophisticated, offering improved ISR and autonomous flight capabilities, along with an ever-expanding range and payload capability. So the question here is, what are the security implications of the growing use of unmanned aerial systems by militant groups in the Middle East? I mean, I'll open it to all, but I think Dr. Whitley had gone a bit into detail about the drones. So maybe Dr. Whitley can address that question.
Thank you for that, and also for the two other panelists who raised really good points, which I mostly agree with. And when it comes to drones, it's not just in the Middle East. My argument was say that once this technology is developed, it is mature, because it relies on digital technologies, it proliferates very quickly. You know, the time where you had a state that decided to develop a nuclear weapon and develop it by gathering a bunch of scientists in the desert and then developing the technology for it and limiting the proliferation, nuclear proliferation, is gone, because here what you're facing with is technology that might be very expensive to develop. But when it is developed, it's very easy to replicate, because it relies on digital technology. Think about the Stuxnet attack, the first cyber weapon against Iran. Iran reversed engineered the codes and then launched a Shamoon attack on Saudi Aramco in 2015 or 16 or 14, I don't remember exactly the year. But the point here is that as this technology develops and is mostly driven by the commercial sectors, it's very easy to repurpose this technology, as we have seen with ISIS. Now, if we look at the attack on Saudi Aramco, it was a combination of uses of current technologies, the use, for instance, of Google Map to specifically identify the location of the facilities. Probably some people on the ground who it might be disseminated some sensors on the ground to actually guide these weapons, and then developing these weapons. They were more advanced than those that ISIS used, but you know, the Houthis claimed the attack, probably Iran was behind that, but it means that even a middle power or a small state has this ability to do that, and then it can proliferate this technology to the hands of its surrogates in the region. And once it is out, it's almost impossible to bring back the genius in the bottle. So this is a very concerning trend, because it will fuel an arms race. And as was mentioned by, I think, the three of us, the offensive has the advantage, and therefore you don't have any system that is able to thwart any of these threats. Therefore, the best thing to avoid any bad surprise is to actually try to prevent the proliferation of this technology. But it is, for now, almost an impossible task to do, because we're already very much ahead in the development of this thing.
I see. Well, makes sense. Another question would be, do emerging technologies put the current state of cybersecurity at risk? Meaning, to what extent does AI lower the bar for cybersecurity attacks by individuals and non-state groups and increase the scale of potential attacks for all actors? I mean, is that something that you see being an issue? Maybe to this question, we can direct maybe to Dr. Zalcman or Dr. Hardy.
Yeah, so I think that the logic follows from what Jean-Marc eloquently just said. Once it proliferates, and the bar is lower, and you have state and non-state actors alike capable of engaging in such activities. You talk about middle powers, small states, big states, great powers. It is extremely difficult, extremely complicated. The multifaceted level is beyond comprehension. It's something that we've never seen before. Yes, so the exclusivity of nuclear weapons was once two great powers. Then it proliferates. Then you have dirty bombs. You have an engineer or a scientist going with a suitcase with the plans and basically selling the plans to whomever he wants, and somebody else buys. I think that one point is that I think that John is right that we're still in this embryonic, this transitioning period where things are not as autonomous as they can potentially be in the long run. So there's still some way to tweak or try to kind of circumvent some of those detrimental and negative impacts. I would say that, for example, supply chains are key because natural resources can be regulated in part. You can build the drone, you can have the technology, but you need something to build it with, and you could perhaps that's the weak spot. This is the weakest link in this chain, and you can prevent, at least in theory. We've seen so many different uses of cyber warfare. Jean-Marc mentioned that one. I wrote about the attack on the Syrian nuclear plant in 2007, which kind of combined, again, as John said, kind of both kinetic and non-kinetic capabilities. So there was a cyber attack that preceded the aerial attack, and so this will be something that will evolve over time and will get smarter, sophisticated, and more lethal. So again, I don't want to be the pessimistic, but I think that we are all pessimistic in this discussion. That and especially given the fact that the offense has the advantage, it seems very, very likely that things will only get worse, unfortunately, unless we find a way to make them slightly worse. I don't want to say better.
Thank you. Dr. Hardy had talked about biotechnology from a slightly different angle. After the 2001 anthrax attacks in the United States, there was a flurry of interest in biological weapons. Since then, however, the focus has been mainly on naturally occurring biological pathogens as opposed to the development of biological warfare agents. I mean, do you see in the next decade this bringing radical changes, or there being any radical changes in terms of biological weaponry? Dr. Hardy?
I think it's a great challenge. I mean, there's definitely a risk of people weaponizing biotechnology. I think for states, probably the most interesting application of that would be the extent we could engineer biological agents which would be able to neutralize the kinds of biological weapons that non-state actors would be more likely to get their hands on. I think a sudden proliferation of biological weapons by states with the means and the resources to be able to generate them is probably not very likely. But the proliferation of either traditional biological weapons or enhanced ones amongst non-state actors is a deep risk that we face. And the question would be whether or not we would be able to generate the kinds of counter agents that would render them less harmful to large populations. And I think actually some of the new technologies that we've seen in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic might indicate that kind of research and development is now gaining significant attention and investment to make it more viable in the near future.
Thank you. Kind of a more basic question on the issue of governance. I mean, all three of you had mentioned this at some point in your various presentations. I mean, many of the barriers to enabling emerging technologies lie not in the technology per se, one could say, but in the governance of technology. And so the question that arises is how the international community, international law, or its application can come up with some sort of framework that enables a response to these different forms of technologies and enables a form of regulation, if you so want. I don't know. I mean, how do you see this developing? I mean, at this current stage in time?
If you want me to jump in, I'm involved in several forums in Geneva and framework of the UN when it comes to this issue, especially governmental group of experts on lethal system. And the problem that we face with the UN is that the DNA of the UN is interstate. You know, it's a snapshot of the international order of 1945. And what we see now is these technology are, for most of them, driven by the private sector. So you need to have a very comprehensive system where you bring in the private sector, the scientific and academic community, the civil society, and states. The problem with this is that all these actors have very different interest and motivation. And we've seen that, for instance, with what happened with regulation of social media platforms. I mean, social media platforms are driven by a commercial interest, which is about monetizing data based on you spending as much time as possible on the website. For states, basically having access, non-state actors having access to this information is critical, because when you start to have access to different databases, then you can infer knowledge that not many people know, and therefore that creates security problems. The problem is that if you want to regulate this thing, you need to speak a common language, and for now we haven't found the right way to do that. For instance, if you we're talking about biology and synthetic biology. Last year, the Nobel Prize of Chemistry was awarded to two women who developed a technology called CRISPR-Cas9, which is a genetic scissors. So it's a very powerful tool to cut sequences of DNA and reconstitute DNA, and it creates a new interaction. So what we've seen since that technology has been developed in the mid-2010 are people in the synthetic biohackers community trying this technology on their own DNA. You know, if you do any experiment on a human genome at university or in academia, you have to go through very strong ethical protocols. And now you have this tool that is out there, and suddenly people are playing with it. So because we have shifted the potential of harm from state level to individual, because we are empowering individual, we need to completely rethink governance, which was based on states and a few states basically calling the shots, to potentially having individual having a strategic impact that has never been seen before. Just think about Snowden and how much data Snowden stole and leaked. One individual, you know, that leaked a huge amount of data that would have never been possible even during the Cold War. So in terms of governance, we are still, it's a big question mark. I mean, improvements are being done, but it's still not satisfactory.
I see. I mean, all three of you gentlemen talked about this idea of an arms race in AI. I mean, how far are these respective countries such as China, Russia, the United States in their programs? I mean, obviously they've made quite some strides, but you know, again, how would you assess the current state of their technology, and how would you then measure their military strength overall? Because again, some have argued that military autonomous systems are slow and incremental in their development, and without comprehensive testing in combat situations, there isn't really telling how they will fare. So again, I mean, there is this perception of having to develop or wanting to develop and compete with other countries. But again, going back to a kind of a best type assessment of these AI programs as they currently stand, how would you assess the situation right now at this point in time? I mean, are they very advanced? Are all of these technologies ready to be employed in warfare? Are there just few, and most of them are still in the development phase? So how should we envision this playing out in the years to come? Is this something that will play out in 10 to 20 years when it'll be much more fully developed? Is it something that will play out in a few years' time?
So Jean-Marc and John may have the technical ability or the ability to talk about the technical status of these technologies, but I want to say from a kind of a more political, more philosophical perspective, perhaps, that the interest is there or the motivation is there. And so it's just a question of time. And if we base it on one of Jean-Marc's slides or one of the things that John said, the exponential development of this technology, so it's just around the corner. We've seen illustrations of that with deepfake. We've seen that during the past elections here in the United States, elsewhere in Europe. And so it's not a question of if, but rather of when. And you know, it might already exist in the hands of one or two countries, or one or two departments in one or two countries, and so on and so forth. So it's not a matter of if, but rather of when, as I said. And it's going back to the question of governance. I think that one way to start the conversation is to start a conversation and include that. We've seen that with, at least in the American case, the domestic case of Facebook, or some of the calls in Congress, for example, to basically to break down this conglomerate and try to break it down into a bunch of, or a number of companies, to try and weaken their ability to control that technology, harness that, monetize it, but then also allow it to proliferate elsewhere and become transition or fungible into something that is military. But again, about the technical state of affairs, I think that Jean-Marc and John are more capable than I am.
Thank you.
Could I just add a really quick comment to that?
Yeah, please.
I think there's a really interesting relationship between the technologies that we're developing in the cyber domain, which would potentially allow you to compromise autonomous systems, and how far you want to push the envelope of your own autonomous systems. And I think actually they kind of balance each other out somewhat, because we all talk about the potential to develop highly capable lethal systems, but I'm not sure that I've met a military commander who's willing to deploy those around their own forces at this time. Not to say that attitude won't change as the acceptance of technology happens, it absolutely will. But I think there is a bit of a handbrake situation there, where you think the more that we're able to compromise this with AI and with cyber technologies, the more we're going to limit the deployment of that in a situation where it could be compromised by another actor. And I think a lot of states are going to have to grapple with that tension between how offensive would we like our own technologies to be, as opposed to how protected would we like them to be if deployed.
Mm-hmm. Well, a follow-up question to you, Dr. Hardy, real quick. Will these technologies require fewer people to be employed in traditional military capabilities, or will they be used in tandem? I mean, will we see a decrease in the toll of human life in future warfare-like scenarios?
I think it's really tempting to think so, mm-hmm. Because we tend to look like even before I said, like, the survivability of forces is much higher. The mortality rate for soldiers in combat today is a fraction of what it was 50 years ago, but the mortality rate for everybody else is still pretty high. In some instances, higher than it ever was, because the sheer destructive power of our systems are quite devastating. Now, I think some of the new technologies that we see will push us towards enhanced precision. And definitely we've seen smaller and smaller payloads on more and more precise weapons right now. Some of those self-guided drones that are essentially missiles that loiter for a long time and self-target are examples of that. They can be very low payload. So we can see, I think, an increase in the survivability of everybody on a battlefield with that. But I also think there's a real temptation there for states to decrease their military in order to save costs and to reduce risks. That's probably not a great idea. For the simple reason that while we all focus on the new technologies, and I think cyber is, an increasingly growing and an absolutely important domain, but also at the end of the day, we could fight without any of our electronic gadgets that we have now. They make us more efficient, they save lives, they make us more combat effective, they're great, but we could do World War II with radios and hand signals if we had to. So I think there will always be a need for people with weapons on a battlefield.
Okay, thank you. Okay, may I now ask you for all three presenters for a 1-minute synopsis of your presentations. I know you've addressed quite a few issues, but in a 1-minute kind of nutshell type summary, what is it that you would like the viewers to kind of know about the future of warfare and AI from your take of things. Dr. Weekly?
Yeah, I think one argument that we share, the three of us, is the exponential nature of this technology. And so if you want to have a snapshot of what exponential growth is all about, look at current pandemic. So if you do not take measures in advance, you delay your measures, to recover from that, it take much more. So now the analogy with warfare is that you cannot wait to think about warfare, wait until the technology is being developed. What you need to do is to think about possible future scenarios, and therefore investing in foresight is very important. And as I mentioned in my last slide about polymath thinking, there has been a trend in academia to train hyper specialists. But by doing that, we have lost the big pictures. So there is a need now to train people who are able to understand technologies, which most people in social sciences and policy making are really bad at, and also be trained technologists and engineers to social sciences, history, philosophy, and ethics. And we need to train these people so that when they develop this kind of technology, they already think about potential implication, about misuses and malicious uses. Because the fact that this technology proliferates very quickly, they are much more difficult to control, and therefore you will always find ways for people to change the purpose of this technology.
Thank you, Dr. Weekly. Dr. Zalcman?
Yeah, absolutely. Just reiterate some of the points. So yes, it proliferates. It's exponentially more developed than ever before. It has negative or might have detrimental implications, kind of a Terminator worst case scenario kind of a thing. There is a great role to both resources as well as knowledge. It's not just about how to develop the technology, it's about the reliance on supply chains, on actual minerals, actual material that you need to in order to procure those, to develop them, to create them. It is receiving more and more attention, even not only in terms of the discourse of the defense community, the security community, but also in terms of the institutional framework. It is created and embedded now as an integral part of any military security posture of any country. There's a role for non-state actors, absolutely. And governance is key, albeit imperfect, as Jean-Marc rightly said. It is very difficult given the way it proliferates and the number of stakeholders that are both states, non-states, and individuals. But the conversation needs to start somewhere, and we better off do it now rather than later, or too late in this case.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Hardy, parting words.
Thank you. I'm going to do something that is a pet peeve of my own, and because I often don't like it when people quote Sun Tzu. But the old maxim that speed is the essence of war, I think, is actually quite appropriate to the context, because one of the key themes across all of the different technologies that we've talked about today is that they increase the speed of something. They increase the speed of data collection, of data communication, of interhuman communication on a battlefield. They increase the speed of our weapons and the countermeasures that we need for those weapons. They increase the speed of computer-assisted decision support and augmented decision-making. They can increase potentially the speed of humans, either on the battlefield or their cognitive processes, and they increase, if not necessarily the speed of decision-making, although I think AI support systems will increase the speed of our decision-making, but I also think they increase the impetus for us to focus on speed and focus on fast decision-making and efficiency in our cognitive processes that have always been important, but now that AI can think faster than we can, are increasingly difficult.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to thank all three panelists for their very interesting presentations. On behalf of Trends, we would like to express our sincerest gratitude for participating in this e-symposium and look forward to welcoming you in one of our future events. In closing, I'd just like to point out that our next e-symposium is scheduled for March 8th at 7 p.m. UAE time. It is on how governments can unlock the potential within individuals communities, and sectors to shape a better future. So a completely different topic, but within the broader areas of interest that have come to shape trends. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Have a nice evening. And again, thank you very much for your presentations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christian.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Have a good
Thank
evening.
you very much.
Bye-bye.